Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us once again for our Black Lives Matter panel discussion tonight. My name is Lynn Hua and I am a National Roots Action Organizer, formerly on the Bernie 2020 National Organizing Team. Tonight's Black Lives Matter panel is hosted by, once again, PAC, a political action committee organizing votes for Bernie Sanders in upcoming primary elections up until the Democratic National Convention in August. Our goal is to reach the 1,200 total delegate threshold that will allow platforms like Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, student debt cancellation, and an end to the for-profit war to head to the convention to be voted on. Platforms, if enacted, would radically transform the lives of all working class Americans. Moving forward in these next couple of weeks, it's important for us to remember in our movement to realize that our fight is intersectional and interconnected with the Black Lives Matter movement in every single aspect. As the daughter of Vietnamese refugees, my family and I wouldn't even be here if Black Americans did not fight for our place to be in this country 50 years ago. And this goes for many other constituencies. We cannot address the Green New Deal or the global climate crisis without considering the impacts of environmental racism. A majority of inhabitants living near hazardous waste or red line communities are predominantly people of color, with dire environmental causes that pollute air, poison water, and dilapidate homes, affecting far more Black families and communities than others. We cannot address Medicare for All without considering racism and the implicit bias in the medical community, nor the lack of access to quality health care. There exists an overwhelming health disparity within our Black and Brown communities. Black Americans currently dying of COVID-19 at 3 times the rate of others. We cannot address student debt cancellation without addressing reforms needed in public education and the pervasiveness of the school to prison pipeline disproportionately affecting Black and Brown youth, to the debilitating death sentence preventing generations from attaining social mobility and the access to resources. And lastly, we cannot address the end to wars, both abroad and home, without addressing America's intrinsic role in upholding the institutional structures of racism, the militarization of state-sponsored violence, and the condemnation through policing and policy resulting in the deaths of countless innocent Black lives and livelihoods, and the exact reason for why we are on the streets today. We stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter because it is absolutely necessary in order for us to progress forward. Our history is tainted by injustices done on Black lives that continue to encroach into our modern day, and justice is long overdue. I'm going to pass it over now to my co-host and fellow organizer, Shanequa Paul, to introduce herself and kick off our panel discussion tonight. Lakshmi?
Thanks, Lynn. My name is Shanequa Paul, and I'm a national organizer at Roots Action and formerly on the Bernie 2020 National Organizing Team, just like Lynn. I'm a Guyanese first-generation American and a Bronx native. I've grown up in predominantly Black and Brown communities and know very personally how the government and people in power have kept our community poor, both fiscally and educationally. They've inflicted violence onto us, kept us under-resourced, and neglected our needs time and time again. But I have also witnessed our determination and intentional care for one another, a call into demanding more because that is what we deserve. That is what this and so many other moments for the fight for Black liberation have been. The Democrats have long been the party to take sides of those on the moral high ground and have been explicitly dependent on the Black vote for decades. We are organizing to get these issues slated on the Democratic Party platform through Bernie's 1,200 delegates because platforms like Medicare for All, Green New Deal, student debt cancellation, and an end to wars would radically transform the lives of Black and Brown working class people once and for all. And because it's time for the Democrats to finally practice what they preach through long-lasting policy rather than performative solidarity. What we have witnessed on the streets and globally for the last week is the tipping point of a never-ending paradigm that has plagued this country for far too long. The people are listening and empowered to demand more. Allies are coming together and our communities are growing stronger. Our global consciousness is becoming more aligned and we are demanding justice now and justice for good. We must continue to find ways to destabilize and delegitimize this corrupt system and build a regenerative, feminist, anti-racist economy that values life, dignity, well-being, right relation to each other and the planet. And it begins with the liberation and value of Black lives in this country. What is at the core is that the ruling class does not like discourse that erodes the power of the 1%. From fluctuations of the stock market and decentralization of the economy, uprisings of a multiracial working class consciousness, or radical women, people of color, and gender nonconforming leaders spearheading the fight for a just society. They will scapegoat Black and Brown communities as they always have done, and protesters with more violence and repression, including martial law, to criminalize dissent. They have spun media narratives that dilute our good intentions and made concessions to maintain the apathy. I read somewhere today that pessimism is a tool of white supremacy, and it's true in that it's inherently violent and supremacist to our own spirit and ability to disrupt the system. The people in power do not want us to think big or imagine a world free of genocide, wealth hoarding, or a white patriarchal status quo. But a new world is possible, and we continue to prove it when we collectively work together to fight for the policies that serve the greater good towards true freedom. So now, without further ado, let's open up the floor and begin our Black Lives Matter discussion. I'm going to go ahead and quickly introduce our panelists, just some amazing folks who are such experts in this field and really going to explain why we must show up in solidarity. So first we have Samelys Lopez, who's a community organizer and housing advocate, born in Puerto Rico and raised in the South Bronx by a Dominican mother. Samelys grew up in New York City shelter system and faced many of the challenges her Bronx neighbors experience: housing scarcity, domestic violence, food insecurity, and the indignities of a welfare system. She has a master's in urban planning with a focus on housing and community development from NYU. Samelys is the co-founder of Local Democrats of New York, and through Bronx Progressives, she helps build independent, community-led grassroots political movements in the Bronx, and she's currently running for Congress in New York District 15. We also have Agunda Okeyo, writer, producer, activist, an alchemist born in Nairobi and raised between New York City and the Kenyan capital. Okeyo understands and writes from a global perspective about race, gender, politics, culture, books, film, and comedy. She is featured as a rising producer in Essence, Black Enterprise, NBC, and the New York Times. In 2017, she served as a comms chair for the March for Racial Justice in Washington, D.C., and nationwide, plus New York City's co-chair. And in spring 2019, she served as a juror at the famed Tribeca Film Festival. Okeyo is the founding director of Women's March New York City and a member of Time's Up in New York City and LA. We also have Sammy Paul, who's an education advocate and student organizer. She's a 19-year-old Brooklyn native dedicated to education reform and increasing accessibility to the arts in low-income communities. Sammy worked dedicatedly towards various diversity initiatives such as decolonizing curricula, diversifying faculty, facilitating cross-cultural dialogue, mentoring young leaders, despite being the only Black woman in her major at Carnegie Mellon and one of 2 graduating female-identifying Black people in her high school. With a BFA in dramaturgy, Sammy plans to foster the creation of Black art and promote diverse voices in theater and the great entertainment industry. We have Shanequa Charles, who's a criminal justice activist and the executive director of Miss Abby's Kids, Inc., a nonprofit focused on producing a more sustainable and healthier Bronx child. She's also the co-founder of Never Be Caged, an organization started to end mass incarceration by investing in the youth. She served on the Bronx Community Board 7, and Miss Charles has organized the Bronx around New York State governor race for Cynthia Nixon and for Jumaane Williams' race for public advocate, which increased voter participation in the borough to the highest in a special election. Her deep belief is that ending mass incarceration relies on prevention and strategic coalition building. She is currently running as a candidate for assembly in District 78. We have Shaid Buttar is American immigrant of Pakistani descent from the UK. He grew up in the Midwest and first came to the Bay Area in 2000 to study law at Stanford. He served as the executive editor of the Environmental Law Journal. He also spearheaded a campaign to promote sustainable building practices and organized a student strike against the war in Iraq. Afterwards, Buttar moved to Washington to work for a law firm where his litigation championed the right to marry the partner of one's choice and an appeal defending bipartisan campaign finance reform for being undermined by the Federal Election Commission. He is currently running for Congress in California's District 12 to unseat Nancy Pelosi. And last, we have Tahese Warley, who has worked with youth and the community as an educator for many years. She holds a BA in music from Clark Atlanta University, a master's in music and management from William Patterson University, and a master's of science in early childhood education from Lehman College. She's currently a kindergarten teacher at a public elementary school and an adjunct lecturer for the School of Education Early Childhood Department at Lehman College. She also serves as a teacher development facilitator in which she mentors and coaches pre-service teachers. Tahese is a Black woman, wife, stepmom, daughter, friend, and educator looking to do her part to make a change. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for this panel discussion. It's an honor to have you all with us tonight, especially on this important topic and after the events that have happened in the last 2 weeks. So how this is going to work is that I'm going to read off some discussion questions and anyone can hop on and give their insight. So I want to start off tonight's discussion with really getting into some reflective, just a reflective conversation on the history of which individuals have come to an understanding in this time. So how has America manipulated and skewed the narrative around civil rights, and how is that manifesting now? So anyone can start off.
Well, I could take a stab at that. It's a pretty profound question. Thank you, Lakshmi. Hello, everyone. Great to be here with you. Well, I mean, the United States is it's founded on the bedrock of this country is white supremacy and systemic racism, specifically against Black people and Indigenous people. So there's been a concerted effort at every stage of progress in the society rewrite history about any kind of innovative gains that are made from any civil rights. So essentially, there's always like a backlash. There's always like a moment in which usually Black people, other communities of color mobilize, are able to push certain rights or expand the social consciousness. That makes certain shifts, sometimes in policy, sometimes not, but it does make a shift and a ripple in society. And then after which time, there are some moments of change and everyone's very proud of themselves. And then subsequent to that, there's usually policies put in place to undermine those gains. And it's a cyclical process that the United States has been in since its genesis. And is something that people should become very aware of and recognize as part of the structural flaw of what it means to be the United States of America. So in order to actually address that, if you don't want to see, continue to see how many videos have I watched today of police brutality against women, especially Black women, which people don't talk about enough, but also certainly against Black men and other communities of color, then we really need to recognize that we're kind of caught in a bit of a pattern. And that tends to be the pattern of how things happen.
Just to jump in there, I absolutely agree. And maybe just to add a note here, we hear about everything from the civil rights movement to our nation's democracy struggle as objects of history that we commemorate and resign to a past as if they were secured. But they haven't been secured. They've never been secured. Even the civil rights movement barely attained, frankly, a fraction of its goals. And all of those gains that it did secure, namely anti-discrimination principles and voting rights, they've been eroded in the years since. But the movement had much more ambitious aims, right? It had socialist aims and demilitarized aims, demilitarization aims. And none of them were even achieved at any point, let alone lost. And the pattern that I want to make sure I get your name right, Agunda?
Agunda, yeah.
That Agunda was describing of the cyclicality, the retrogression in the wake of gains is a really critical one to grip and acknowledge, because all of the gains we celebrated the civil rights movement, generally we have lost. And we are witnessing under our feet the rise of authoritarianism in the United States. And I absolutely recognize and agree that Black Lives Matter, and that was the thing that got us in the street. The state's response to the movement implicates much more than merely Black lives. The state's response to the movement implicates our most basic conceptions of liberty. And they are at stake and at risk very much at the moment. And at the same time that we need to make sure that Black lives matter, we need to make sure that our democracy survives this administration. And I'm very grateful to all the voices and everyone in the movement from coast to coast who's been using our voices and our bodies to hold the line and to guard our neighbors and our democracy.
If I could just jump in, thank you for having me here. In terms of the civil rights movement and how it has, there's a story, basically as an educator, a lot of times the way it's put out there is that the civil rights movement was a moment in time and that the work is done. And at that means that people will stop educating themselves and learning and paying attention to what's really going on. And so now when something big happens, something, like unfortunately the death of George Floyd, now people are outraged and saying, but I thought we came so far. I thought there was no work left to be done. And that is how, the story, the narrative has changed. We keep telling ourselves or telling people that there's no work left to be done, but there's always work to be done. And I definitely agree with both the panelists that just made great points that, there are different policies put in place to undermine the work that has been done. But again, because we've been fed that lie that there's nothing else to do, so many people turn a blind eye to what's going on and they don't even notice the changes that are taking place and that it's actually undermining the work that has been done.
So greetings, family. First and foremost, thank you for assembling this very serious and much needed discussion that hopefully not only raises awareness for folks, but inspires people to continuous action. When we talk about the structural forms of institutionalized racism and the deconstruction of the value of life, I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind moving forward is that if we rely on a system that quite literally was built to separate and isolate people and keep them in silos, keep us in silos away from each other, much of the same will continue. We are in a moment right now, like everyone that spoke before me has indicated, that it is not an isolated moment in time. And the things that have moved us from our inception in this country, which rested on brutality and violence, have now led us to this moment where even in the last 50 years, everything that has been accomplished has slowly been undermined by elected government. And, I'm not afraid to call that exactly what it is. It's much like the parable of shaking a soda bottle and knowing that when you take the top off, the Coca-Cola inside is going to explode all over the place, and you have on a white shirt and it gets on your white shirt. We can be upset that we have a stain on our shirt, or we can be upset at the hand that's shaking the bottle, knowing that when they take the top off, there's going to be an eruption and going to be an explosion. A lot of what I'm seeing and experiencing and my community members are seeing and feeling is that the narrative is being driven away from the fact that humanity in this manner doesn't matter at most by the people who are supposed to be protecting it, and that the focus is being shifted to the eruption, right? There's going to be so many different layers of action that takes place that is going to move us from point A to point Z, and it will look like protests of all sorts. This phenomenon of peaceful protest, I don't understand that when we're saying no justice, no peace. Therefore, if we're not getting the justice that we're supposed to have, how can you offer peace in order to get the justice? It doesn't go. It doesn't make logical sense to my community, to our communities. And so the eruption and the rebellion is something that no point in time have we ever achieved anything great without there being some type of bloodshed, without there being some type of enormous pushback on the oppressive statues that are continuing to destroy And we see that clearly the narrative is being disrupted by a poor educational system, by lack of resources in communities of color, intentionally divested from medical treatment that is subpar, that leave our bodies and our minds weak, so that the fight is lessening. But as we see around the world, Black Lives Matter because they've been completely destroyed intentionally over and over and over again. And so those are part of the ways in which we've identified that the narrative is being shifted from what the actual issue is to misplaced anger and mistrust.
Good night, everyone. I just want to highlight something that Shanequa said. As a student especially, I think a large part of this is also with the demystifying of how large of a problem this is the history that's being taught in schools. A lot of the history that I know personally, I had to seek out either by myself because of like my own personal interest, taking classes in school that were offered in college, even at like 9 a.m. at super inaccessible times for students to learn about things like convict leasing, about things that are like the core of what is really creating this system right now. Students are not getting the education that they need in school to really understand things like the Black Panther movement, other than like a terrorist organization. Students are not understanding what the war on drugs actually did and how it contrasted so greatly to the opioid crisis when that was attacking like rural white communities. People are not talking about how the 1% is suppressing poor people of all colors, despite, and like pitting us against each other. And a lot of this conversation is not something that's been happening in school, and it's only if you're interested in it, and it's making a situation where it allows adults to go into the world completely oblivious to these situations. And unless you're having active conversations with Black students or people of color around you, which a lot of people are not having, they're able to go through their entire lives without learning any of the history that really is our history, America's history, not Black history, not a single group's history, but our history.
Yeah, I want to jump in really quickly and thank everybody for inviting me with this amazing panel. It's a pleasure to share this space with you this evening. I want to echo what has just been said. One of the things that I reflect on and think about a lot and have been talking a lot about recently in different interviews that I've been on is the importance of educating people about the legacy of slavery in this country, and how the legacy of slavery has basically impacted every institution that we have, and how the legacy of slavery has been whitewashed in our public schools, and that we're not learning about the contributions of Black and Brown communities in the education system, and that needs to be a required class for everybody in the community, in the educational system. White Americans need to learn this history as well, and understand that this country was built, on capitalism, on slavery, on a lot of brutality, and there needs to be an atonement for that. So that's kind of like where I stand, and how I feel that the education system needs to, basically like teach this real history that happened. And I think that criminal justice is something that needs to be taught in the schools as well, so that people can protect themselves and know, how to deal with law enforcement. I feel like that should be required in the public school system, just like, financial literacy should be a requirement, and other issues, because how do you deal with somebody that, supposedly is trying to protect you? Like, there's a way of dealing with that. It's like an invisible language. And I don't feel like the public school education system is doing enough to empower our youth to face this brutality. And I think that we need to demilitarize the police. We need to defund all police departments across the country and use those savings to give back to the community in terms of social services, in terms of reparations for Black communities that have bared the brunt of injustice in this country. We need to build housing for people. We need better jobs. We need a strong labor movement. And we need to dismantle capitalism as we know it too, because capitalism is something that seeks to divide and conquer us as a community. And we need to honor Black lives. We need to honor the workers that are the ones that create the wealth in this country. And we need to rectify the imbalance that exists between the 1% and the 99%. So it's a lot of issues, but I think we need to learn that learn the concept of what happened in terms of the foundation of this country, how it was built in the education system. And I don't feel like that's something that we're learning right now. At least like I didn't learn it. Like I had to seek it out myself. And also I'm Puerto Rican and Dominican, and there's a lot of colorism and racism also that exists in Latin America. And when I went to college, like I took it upon myself to learn about that history and how to dismantle that. So I think that that's something that should be required for everybody in this country to learn about.
Just to add a thought there, and it's good to see you again, Samelys. I feel like I see you as much as I see anyone these days. The idea, particularly of this legacy of slavery and gripping with and grappling with its continuing, not just impacts as a historical matter. We practice slavery in the United States today. That's what the penal system is. Slavery remains legal under the terms of the 13th Amendment as a condition of punishment, which is effectively why we have mass incarceration in this country. The United States has always preferred slave labor to fair labor. And you have to recognize the role of policing in that. And just to connect this to another historical arc, it's impossible to talk about mass incarceration or militarized police in the United States without addressing its root. And we rarely address the CIA's role in sparking a drug war that millions of Americans have paid the price for. And the agency never did. And it's admitted that it ran crack cocaine into LA and Miami in the 90s. And when US cops started getting gunned down by narco traffickers trained, funded, and equipped by the CIA, what was our response as a nation? Did we hold the CIA accountable? No, we put millions of Black and brown bodies in prison. And that in particular is something we not only need to atone for, we have to stop doing it and unwind it. And there's no way, when we talk about the wanton state violence and police murders that we see around the country, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The whole enterprise, frankly, is pervaded by corruption. And we have to recognize that too.
Definitely. I feel like the theme that every panelist just expressed was the need to unlearn things that were not given to us through our education system, through any formalized way, and also the fact that we're navigating a system that was not built to really protect Black lives, to empower Black lives, and we're seeing the ramifications of that. And in that, I really want to move the conversation to what actions can people take, specifically non-Black allies? What practical actions can they take in the education system, in the arts, in politics, whatever it may be? What are things in your particular fields that there are moments of intervention that people can start to do, recognizing that, yes, we in the last 2 weeks, there has been calls to hit the streets, there have been calls to mobilize and be in solidarity, but there are many moments of intervention here. And so would love to hear folks talk about how we can show solidarity and start to do active unlearning together.
If I could start, in terms of education, the first thing that we all have to do is acknowledge the fact that our school system is part of a racist system. It was built on that, right? And without acknowledging that, you cannot start to unlearn. The second thing that needs to happen is all of us, but anyone who wants to be an ally, is educating yourself on how the school system has been set up to keep Black and brown children down, right? How it has not empowered us. So we talked about that in our history books. It glosses over everything. It gives us a this really short chapter on the civil rights movement, maybe a blurb about slavery, and that's it. And as one of the other panelists said, in order to get that education, sometimes you have to go about it on your own. And so we need to acknowledge that the school system right now is part of is an institution involved in systemic racism. And we have to now educate ourselves on ways to overcome that. For those who are allies, right? We want you to acknowledge your privilege that you have and use that to be a voice. Okay, use that to support your colleagues of color as they also take up this fight. So those are some ways to help. Yeah, sorry.
So, with respect to what an ally can do to ensure that the rights of marginalized communities, in this instance, we are talking about Black and Brown bodies that continue to be abused and obliterated and murdered, for trauma to continue to happen when we visualize those occurrences, whether across the news, social media, or in our independent circles. One of the main things that folks can do is absolutely hold your colleagues, family, friends accountable when you see them participating in that type of behavior. Even as simple as stopping a conversation of your colleague, friend, neighbor, and correcting them. Because once you have the information, you're responsible for the folks that are in your circle, in your circumference, in your community that you share villageship with, and getting the information to them. And so it's no longer okay to even say Black Lives Matter and stand with anyone on the front line if at home you are still engaging in even those demeaning conversations that we know transpire behind closed doors. The door of secrecy has to be busted through. And I say that because we are always in a lot of different circles and a lot of different atmospheres where, our counterparts are with us one moment, but just for that moment. It has to take place in the root of everybody's village. I got sent a video about a young girl, a Caucasian woman who was having a conversation with her, I guess her father or maybe an uncle. And she was taping the conversation because she was trying to show that she was trying to educate her father on the actual pain and plight that she understood Black lives to be going through in this moment in time. And she continued to rebut. And I think that those closed door conversations are some of the most critical and key conversations, because even the allies that we have that are putting their bodies on the line and saying, I am not like my ancestors that enslaved your ancestors, and I'm not like these folks who continue to break you down in this moment, demonstrate and illustrate that change needs to occur in the thought process. Because if change doesn't occur in the thought process, it doesn't matter if you come and stand next to me out there when you're still thinking those things. Because when you're still thinking those things, physiologically, the subconscious mind trains the body to act on those things. And so it'll cause you to grab your purse when I get in an elevator. It will cause you to look at me differently if I'm standing before you and you are the judge. And all of the areas and spaces where our white counterparts are employed deeply to the magnitude that impact lives, mainly teachers, in the educational system, mainly judges who were on the bench, mainly policymakers who do not look like the communities that they represent. All of these people need to be held accountable to the extent that they are inserting education into our school system that not only teaches the history and the foundation of this country and what actually happened to Black people once they got here, but also teaches the elements and the functions of organizing, teaches the elements and the functions of resolution-based thinking. It's not enough to tell somebody about the problem. People need to be able to resolve the problem. And when they're going to the bodies that can resolve the problem, demand what it is that those specific communities need in order for the problem to be resolved. It's not enough to show up for a rally. It's not enough to go live from a march. We have to make sure that if you are calling yourself an ally, that you are holding all of the same meetings with your counterparts that we are when we are trying to organize community to fight back against all of these different injustices. And as everybody on the panel has said, occur in each and every facet that creates a community, which is the educational system, the structure that is policing, and our healthcare system, and absolutely in our economic stability situation, which is unstable. We are in Bronx County. There are 62 counties in New York State. Bronx County is number 62 out of 62, the worst performing as it pertains to health, education, and the penal system. In addition to that, the part of Bronx County that I'm in the 78th Assembly District, is the worst performing out of Bronx County. So quite literally, we are here in a moment in time where it is the worst of a possible situation for anyone. Allies must be able to pull their people in who are in positions of power, educate them. That is not enough. They must move to action and make sure that they are creating policies, legislation, making decisions that pertain to people's freedoms and liberation and liberty, and acting fairly in accordance to what equity would look like for folks of all colors, regardless of class.
I would
jump in. Sorry, you can go ahead.
Okay. And I just wanted to just say something in direct response to that. And I think when you're having those conversations, I think really get into, don't keep on investigating Blackness, but really also investigate whiteness and why these situations have happened in your family time and time again, why it has taken George Floyd's death for you to realize this is an entire problem. Because I think that there's you will never be an expert on my experience, but you know your experience and you know the ways that you've been implicit, and to be honest about those ways, because as we're talking about, this isn't a thing that bad people do. We're talking about a system that is taught everyone how to get in line within it, and to undo that and to unlearn that is to talk about your own implicit biases, to talk about how you felt, why did you feel uncomfortable, and to really dig through that with your family and with those around you. I think also to be organizing with Black people, especially if you're on a college campus or in spaces where your body really does matter, and to organizers to be able to show that that the voices in your campus, especially if they're small, matter, and to amplify them as much as you can. I think that's really important, especially if there's a lot of different things that are going on. Stay in touch with what your governor and your mayors are doing. Stay in touch with what the people that you elected are doing, and make sure that they're doing stuff for you, because there's a lot of things that right now are being exposed. And we really need to stay in touch with that and make sure that we're paying attention.
I agree with what everybody's saying in terms of these strategies of how to be a better ally. I would also like to put a heavy highlighter and underline under talking about and exploring and understanding the concept of white supremacy. Because I think one of the greatest problems that people who are allies have is they think that whiteness is a thing, and it isn't a thing. It's a construct, just like the rest of these identities that we all experience. But they're also manifest, meaning that there are lived experiences that come from these constructs, whether it's my Blackness in America and what and then also what whiteness means for somebody else in the United States, which is usually a disproportionate access to resources and the privilege of being ignorant of facts and information about how the world actually is. I think the greatest problem in general with white supremacy is that it deprives the individual who benefits from it of a critical analysis. You usually don't develop a critical thinking. You usually don't actually even source information from places that are actually factual. A great deal of what undergirds white supremacy is propaganda and misinformation. So one thing people really understand if you want to be an ally is a great many of your worldviews and thoughts about how the world works and benefit to you are fictions, but they're fictions that actually are manifest and support you having a successful and beneficial life. And furthermore, I'd also say in terms of allyship, I'm an immigrant from East Africa and grew up here in the States, a New Yorker, but people need to understand the global nature of white supremacy and nature and the interlocking nature of how the global subjugation of Black people is incredibly critical to the support and undergirding of white supremacy globally. So once you start looking at how it manifests in the United States and really looking at how there's been people over the centuries, frankly, who've been trying to find ways to puncture that very blind perspective, that snow blindness that white supremacy affords people, that there also is a global conversation around this, and it's been there also for hundreds of years as well. So I think political education is number one for white people, and to feel okay with the discomfort of recognizing that a number of things that one might believe are bedrocks of their identity are actually complete constructs and certainly do not serve the rest of humanity.
I want to pick up on something that was just said about like whiteness, white supremacy being a global construct. That is definitely true. I think that, you know, I was talking about Latin America before, how there's a lot of colorism, a lot of anti-Blackness in Latin American countries, in countries like the Dominican Republic, you know, and me being part Dominican, you know, that's something that I saw firsthand. And my mother is Afro-Dominican, and that's why I took it upon myself to learn about that history, to embrace my culture, to embrace the African elements of my culture that exist in the music that I grew up listening to, and salsa, merengue, bachata, and the food that I eat. I mean, it's present in every part of culture. And it's really important to recognize the African ancestry in, you know, our communities. And one of the things that I have gravitated towards is cultural organizing. There's a Afro-Caribbean musical tradition that's called Bomba y Plena, that it's basically an Afro-Caribbean Christmas carol musical procession called Bomba y Plena, where we basically like bring music to people's homes, to the streets, like around the holiday season. And it has its roots in African culture. And that's something that I think that in terms of culture, in terms of organizing, we need to reclaim our history, especially in communities that are gentrifying rapidly, like the ones that I hope to represent in the South Bronx, the 15th Congressional District. There's an intense gentrification and a displacement crisis. And one of the things I've looked to in a small way is the power of cultural organizing to basically act as an act of resistance, to let people know that we are going to be here. You're not going to displace us. And, you know, we're going to let the community know that this is our culture. This is like who we are. So, you know, in the years leading up to, you know, me running for this position, like I've actively sought out that musical tradition and embrace cultural organizing so that, you know, we can be proud of who we are as a culture, because in our diversity is our strength. And that's one of the reasons that I think, or one of the ways that allies can, you know, educate themselves and seek out diversity and explore these concepts so that we could come together as a community and have those uncomfortable conversations that need to be had in closed doors, and recognize things like privilege and how that's standing in the way of empowerment and self-determination and dignity for all. I think it's an active process. It's an act of self-discovery. And, you know, I encourage everybody, if you're watching this show, to really delve deep and listen to activists on the ground, listen to Black women, listen to frontline activists that are putting their lives on the line and sacrificing, and always listen to the experiences of directly impacted people and everything that we do in the community.
A couple of things I'd want to share here, and I really appreciate Samelys's invitation to address music. And I want to hit notes here with respect to music, privilege, and then policy. So first, with respect to music, one of the points Samelys made is that the beneficiaries of Black culture in the United States extend well beyond Black communities. If you like jazz, if you like rock and roll, if you like hip hop, if you like music in the United States, if there's any kind of culture form, dance, if there's any kind of art form, if there's any kind of like sports form that you appreciate, Black culture permeates the United States, and even white Americans have benefited from it at the same time. And that appropriation, you know, if we want to, I've heard a lot of people in the last week talk about looting. Let's talk about looting, right? The vast scale of the theft and appropriation from Black communities, just in the current time slice, let alone over the last accumulated 4 centuries, is frankly incalculable. And particularly when we start talking about Black lives, because any number of businesses that might be looted, you can rebuild, you can restock, you can't bring lives back. And there have been entirely too many taken. There have been some comments inviting people to consider and explore whatever privileges you might inhabit. And that is really important personal work. And I just want to, you know, raise up a couple notes that got address there. One is to identify and acknowledge your privileges. Step two is to redeploy those privileges actively on behalf of people who are less fortunate. One of the things that falls off there is the need to listen first, to put your ear to the ground and make sure that what you're doing is actually helpful. Taking direction from the communities that you're standing in alliance with is a critical distinction between being an ally versus being yet another unhelpful, invasive white savior, right? I mean, so taking direction from the allies that you're trying to be helpful to, showing up, is really critical. There are a lot of organizations that particularly serve white communities who want to serve in solidarity with our neighbors. Surge comes to mind, standing up for racial justice. There's any number of others. The opportunity to think globally and act locally comes to mind. And I want to just put sharp, make that very sharp. We talked about privilege, we talked about music, I want to talk about policy. We are all approached by any number of figures, and I'm thinking here particularly about corporate Democrats, who peddle the interests of the communities that we're talking about, Black communities, brown communities, low-income communities of any race, and don't show up for our needs and our interests. And it is up to all of us to hold those figures accountable. And what that looks like ultimately is not falling for the ruse anymore. It looks like replacing long-serving incumbents who have proven their fidelity to the established predatory paradigm. And it looks like taking our concerns, from the street into our lives, our dinner table conversations, and the ballot box. And we need policies to reflect our cultural recognition of the grand theft that continues from Black people and Black communities.
Definitely. On that note, I want to shift us to, we just talked about individual actions and contextualized it in the larger system and policies and just the larger infrastructure that we're navigating at all times. Even if we can make individual choices, we're always going to be navigating within white supremacy, within the patriarchy, within all of these complex systems. And so what I'm interested in is, how would progressive policy specifically transform the livelihood of Black people in the US? And so Lynn and I both mentioned Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, end to for-profit wars, and an end to student debt, specifically, and how they would be transformative for Black life. But curious as to what other policies or how those particular policies would manifest in the Black liberation movement, and also thinking to the candidates. We are fortunate enough to be joined by candidates who are running for various local positions right now. And so just interested in hearing how policy reform is also an act of solidarity during this time.
So in my particular district, the 78th Assembly District in the Bronx, there are many different ways in which policy on the state level can definitely impact Black lives in our community, marginalized lives in our community. First and foremost, the act of deconstructing what is now known as the police department and how policing happens in the community is one of the first things that would be on the agenda. Now, with respect to the amount of funding that goes into policing, so on and so forth, it makes sense to dig deeper into these communities, into our communities of 133,000 people, of which 50% are under the age of 30, and really analyzing what some transformative modes of governing ourselves could look, and feel like, thereby identifying various ways in which we would operate in community, and then identifying when someone causes harm inside that community, what does it look like to gather the person harmed and the person that did the harming, and figure out how restitution can be made so that the fabric of community is not continuously torn apart by punitive measures all the time. We understand that in some moments in time, folks will need a timeout, what is considered a timeout. But I think that those things need to be identified by the communities that they're in, and not subjugate people to follow specific rules that they didn't necessarily agree to follow in order to be a part of the community itself. Those have to be self-governing. And I believe that with a lot of deep-rooted work that could happen. Two,
with regard to our educational system, a lot of talk is happening around high school and college, but the personalities of a human is pretty much formed by the age of 7 and 8. And for nearly 20 years in the field of chemical dependence and severe psychiatric disorder therapy and treatment that I've provided to hundreds of thousands of people over the span of nearly 20 years, what we understand is that if we invest in prevention with young people up front, it will offset anything that happens in the latter parts of their lives. So if we take the time and actually invest in our young people scholastically, teaching them the history, teaching them how to problem solve, they become more sustainable later on. So the education system within itself needs to be revamped. The other part that is critically important in our community, especially, is economic inclusion, because our community is intentionally divested from and has been for decades. What it did was it compiled people in a very condensed area to live in a state of lack. So a lot of the crime that happens inside of the community is as a result of that lack, and lack of proper education, proper training, proper even entrepreneurial mindset thinking to empower folks to be able to accumulate resources for their families and for their communities. And so if we address all of those things up front, in addition to making sure that our seniors and our veterans are cared for, number one, when they come back from service, which, my daughter Miracle came home one day and I asked her, I said, "Hey, Miracle, how was school today?" She said it was good. And every day I asked her what she learned. Today she told me she learned about Christopher Columbus this particular day. She told me that I already started gripping my chair, but I tried to just let her freely tell me what happened. She said, "I learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America and he was a great guy. And this is why we're here today." I said, was there anyone here when he got here, Miracle? She said, "Oh yeah, you're talking about the Indians. Yep, there wasn't enough space for them. So he found them some more land and moved them to that land." That prompted me to have her do her own independent research as a second grader, to understand that not only was that not the truth, but that she had been taught that by people who were supposed to be trained and paid to teach her the truth, and she was not. It was in that moment that a 5-page letter to the school, the director, and the board of directors began. And I took my daughter out of the educational system and I began homeschooling her. 2 years later, she's 99th percentile in the nation in math, and she is college level reading. She started her first business at the age of 6, where she uses the proceeds from her company to end hunger amongst people experiencing homelessness. I say all of that to say that all of the programs that we have built in the last 6-7 years with Miss Abby's kids do exactly that. Teach our young people how to be free critical thinkers, and not only that, how to be sustainable adults that thrive and not only have to survive. And so if we use some of those program models and many others that have been created by many other women in community, men in community broadly, that we will actually stand a fighting chance in being able to shift from where we are now to a much better place for our children to be later. So it's multi-layered and it's multi-dimensional.
So I'd like to say that the only change that will actually be really beneficial to the United States or any society really is systemic change. And you get to a certain point where once you get people on your side and they recognize and understand the issue, like this current moment where it's taken arguably hundreds of years for people to recognize that extrajudicial killings of Black people is not cool, but at least right now people seem to be on a popular level aware of that not being completely unjust and completely cruel and not the way a functioning democracy should operate. But I would say that on a policy level, one of the policies I'd flag probably would be the Green New Deal, because the climate issue has a lot of different tentacles. A lot of times people don't recognize that the climate issue is also what affects migration patterns. So a lot of the people who we maybe are saying, oh, they're fleeing from this country or that country trying to come into the United States, are also reacting to climate disasters, whether that's disasters that destroy the ability for them to work as agrarian farmers, or if that climate disaster is man-made by people doing overlogging and kind of destabilizing their communities. And we've certainly seen that here in the United States with the No DAPL movement, where the issues of environment are very much intertwined in people's sense of security, access to clean water, access to clean air. Certainly the Bronx, we know that, there's a high statistics around asthma uptown. So I think it's really important for people to understand that perhaps maybe it's a kind of hybrid between the allyship and the policy question, where you could actually just educate yourself about a particular policy issue that touches you and that you personally have a stake in, and then be able to figure out how, as an ally, get behind the organizers already on the ground doing the work around that particular issue, who are often Black and brown folks, and find a way to support those individuals to help push forward whatever policy changes need to be made locally, statewide, and federally. Because without systemic change, without systemic shifts, and ones that are codified and collectively acknowledged, because that's one of the biggest things. You can change a policy structurally, but if there isn't a collective stake in that change, it can easily be eroded by bad actors. So it's really important for us to take the moment that we're in and recognize that we're all collectively looking at basically the same stuff, which is pretty unusual, I would say, and certainly been kind of exacerbated by the pandemic and making us all kind of in a fantastic and kind of horrific way find a way of connecting with one another in a deeper way that has never happened before, at least not in my lifetime. And from what I talked to with elders, they've never seen this either. So we're definitely experiencing a really powerful moment. So support the people doing the work, already mobilizing in that direction, pick the policies that we care about. I mentioned climate, but Green New Deal or what have you. I think that we could actually make some really long-term changes that some of the young folks are really, really anxious for.
If I could just jump in, when I look thinking about the different policies, like the end to student debt is something that definitely needs to change. Here we live in a country where we say that you need education in order to advance or to to be successful, and we put up these barriers of how much it costs to go to college to learn, and what happens is we have our youth that do take on this task to go to school. They come out of school with so much debt, it puts them behind. And how can you're trying your best to keep up, and you're trying to pay off these debts? We know that here in this country, in terms of the majority culture, the reason that they have their wealth is they own property, they own land, and they a lot of times are able to succeed, move on in life because they don't have this debt dragging them back. And so we need to look at how we can give education to all and not put someone so far behind because they're drowning in debt. In terms of in the education, I work with young children, and there has to be change in how the education system works, the curriculum that we use. A lot of times we go out, when they pick curriculum, they go out to these big corporations who know nothing about the students that we're working with. They know nothing about the communities and their culture. And it's this, one size fits all curriculum that we're supposed to teach to these children. And we're not preparing them for life. We say we're preparing them for college, but we're not preparing them for life. They don't, like someone mentioned earlier, we're not teaching them about economics or finances. We're not teaching them even about their own history. So there has to be some reform a lot of reform in education. And at all levels, whether it's through the curriculum, the materials, the resources. I grew up in suburban New York, where I was one of the only. However, what I can say is that I never noticed a lack of resources. Depending on your zip code, your school or those schools in the area seem to receive more funding. And then now I've been working in the Bronx for so many years, and depending on what school you're in, you might see more resources than not, but it's not the same. And we know that your zip code determines what type of funding goes into those schools, if it's a public school or a private school. And so we need to, that needs to change. You know, the people that we put in office, we need people in place that are going to look at the policies, that are going to look at education and really dig deep and figure out how can we make the change.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree with everything that's been said. Of art platform, what I'm fighting for Congress is things like a homes guarantee, universal housing as a human right, universal access to healthcare, because right now healthcare should not be tied to whether you have a job or not. And like what's happening with the coronavirus, a lot of people are jobless right now because they don't have the jobs, because everything has been shut down in our community. Like if I get around my community by biking, so like I've been biking around a lot in the district, and I see a lot of empty storefronts, a lot of people that don't have jobs, and these people are struggling without healthcare. Like I'm running for Congress without healthcare right now. So I think that we need to organize our economy in a way that centers the worker, centers the most marginalized and oppressed. We need to fight for things like universal childcare. There are many working families that sometimes have to choose to leave their home because they don't have money to afford a babysitter right now. And that's something that would give people peace of mind if they go to work. In terms of reproductive justice, the Black maternal mortality rate is so high because of the racism that also exists in our health system as well. A Green New Deal was mentioned. The South Bronx has one of the highest rates of asthma and respiratory illnesses in the entire country, which is a legacy of racist urban planning policies that were enacted by people like Robert Moses back in the day, that basically cut up our neighborhoods and basically put highways next to our communities that have polluted our air and our lungs. And also bad economic policy choices by our political leaders, courting companies like Fresh Direct to come into the neighborhood that are coming in with trucks, that release diesel fuel emissions, that continuously pollute our air. In light of an environmental impact statement that was disrespected, that said, if you bring in these trucks into this community, there's going to be more asthma rates and respiratory illnesses in this neighborhood. So I'm passionate about a Green New Deal. But an implementation of a Green New Deal has to be led by the directly impacted people here in the neighborhood and the existing environmental justice space that exists here in the Bronx, because there are activists here and organizations here that have organized around environmental justice for decades, so that we need to look to them for guidance in terms of what an implementation of a Green New Deal is going to look like on the ground. And the policies that I just mentioned, homes guarantee, Green New Deal, the decarbonization of the New York City Housing Authority as well, that's something that's really critical, because right now NYCHA is not getting the funding that it needs to make sure that people are living dignified lives. We need to repeal the Faircloth Amendment as well. That's basically preventing new public housing from being constructed in this country. So it's a lot of issues. And these policies, we can look to local hiring opportunities for people in the community so that they could get paid a living wage at least $20 an hour, and to identify people in the community to help us build 12 million units of housing over the next decade, to help us build sustainable housing, to train them on green jobs so that they could access the jobs of the future. And we also need a strong labor movement. We need to educate people about the importance of unions, turning to unions as a way of organizing. Right now, the labor movement in this country is under assault. So that's something that, we need to organize around, and organize the economy so that we as workers can get the benefits that we pay into the system already. Because right now, the tax policy is written basically by corporate lobbyists, and it's really hard to understand. And we need to make sure that we fight for economic democracy in this country so that we can have an economy that's organized, by the workers and with workers in mind, so that we can get access to human rights like housing as a universal human right, healthcare, a Green New Deal. And one of the most important things that we could do is, in the political process, continue to reject the influence of big money in politics. That is so important, because if you're taking sources of oppressive funding that is pushing our communities out and disrespecting, Black and brown communities and working class communities, you don't deserve to be in office, because you're going to be more responsive to the donors and not the people. I mean, I'm really proud that in the campaign that we've run, we have raised our donations from 80% small grassroots dollar donations in the community. And we lead in the race right now with the highest number of individual grassroots donations. And our average donation is about $15, which is amazing. A lot of those people that donate are actually from the district, sometimes donating $2, $3. So I think that we need to reject the influence of big money in politics. We need to demilitarize again the police force. We need to make sure that we institute consent decrees all over the United States to make sure that police are put on notice when they commit abuses, when they have histories of complaints that are waged against them by the community. We need to amend the 13th Amendment of the Constitution that says that it's okay for people in prison to be paid slave wage to be done. But I think at the end of the day is really important to continue to seek the guidance of all the women that are on this panel. I want to give a quick shout out to Shanequa Charles, who's a woman that I deeply admired throughout the years I've been organizing here in the Bronx, always putting herself on the front lines with her daughter, with her family, always doing the right thing. And we need to uplift each other and amplify our message, our stories, and humanize the conversation, that we can take back our politics and make sure that, it's for the 99%. We need a working class revolution in this country that's multiracial. And I guess I'll end it with that. Yeah.
I had a few thoughts here about the policy goals that I think we need to put in place to realize racial justice. And I want to riff here on intersectionality and particularly talk about Hunters Point, a neighborhood here in San Francisco, and then talk particularly about policing. So we've heard a broad range of ideas in response to this question, and it demonstrates the nature and the notion of intersectionality. The vectors of both marginalization and liberation compound each other. And that's one reason why, for instance, Medicare for All would have such a, frankly, potentially transformative impact, not just for working class people, but also as a racial justice matter, because it would expand the ability to seek preventive care to entire populations that don't have it now. When we talked about the Green New Deal, I want to particularly just emphasize the federal jobs guarantee as a component of it that would provide vital economic stimulus also to many communities that have been denied it. I think somebody had mentioned the need to demilitarize not just police forces, but I want to here also just draw a circle around our military industrial complex, which is driven at the moment by a poverty draft, which places entirely too many Black and brown bodies at risk because it's the locus of opportunity for many people who don't have access to it through other means. So having talked about intersectionality, I want to talk about a particular neighborhood here in San Francisco. And staying on our city's conscience, San Francisco has a reputation around the country for being a proud progressive bastion. And the people of our city are generally. We've gone through a number of very dramatic transitions in the last many years, including dramatic gentrification and displacement. One of the last few remaining African-American enclaves in the entire city of San Francisco is a neighborhood called Hunters Point. And it's the site of a former US Navy shipyard, which basically poisoned the neighborhood for 50 years with radioactive poisoning. It's now been declared a Superfund site. And it happens to be the part of the city where the city leadership has been particularly adamant about building new housing on top of radioactive soil. And the soil samples from the corporate cleanup have been found on multiple occasions to be fraudulent. And it would be great if there were a powerful member of Congress representing San Francisco who might show up to go to bat for Hunters Point. And it could be legislation, it could be oversight, it could be constituent services. There's lots of different ways to serve your community when you have a seat in Congress. And Nancy Pelosi, unfortunately, hasn't done any of those things. And I see that the cancer rates in that neighborhood are through the roof. The breast cancer rates in particular are among the highest in the world. The asthma rates in that neighborhood are through the roof. And it's a glaring case of environmental racism in this nation's most progressive city in broad daylight. And it's not a new issue. It's been festering for decades and no one's done anything about it. And it's just one example of how Democrats, this is a Democratic district in a Democratic city in a Democratic state, how Democrats have been thoroughly complicit in the abdication of any modicum of racial justice. And let me just finally close with policing here. There's a 20-point criminal justice reform platform that our campaign put together in 2018. I'm very grateful for the support in putting it together, including folks who had served as, one of them in particular was a law clerk to the first African-American appointed to the federal bench. And she and they, the team, put together a remarkably prescient, wide-ranging vision that basically remixed all of the demands of the movement for Black lives with the movement for immigrant rights. I'd encourage people to check it out. It's available on Medium. Two pieces I want to just raise up. One of them was introduced in Congress this week by Representative Ilhan Omar and Justin Amash. Ilhan Omar is a Democrat from Minnesota. Justin Amash is a Republican from Michigan. They agree on the need particularly to end qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a judge-created doctrine in the 1960s that lets cops get away with vicious, even lethal violence without needing to face legal repercussions. And one thing the movement has been doing around the country is taking over DA offices, that is to say the local prosecutors who can bring criminal charges. Reforming qualified immunity is a way to enable the civil justice system as an alternative lever for accountability. I'm proud to have proposed that reform 2 years ago. I'm excited to see it now finally introduced in Congress, and I'm looking forward to removing Nancy Pelosi so we can finally make that the law. A few people have noted particularly the phenomenon of recidivist cops, that is to say cops who are repeat offenders, like the one who killed George Floyd or the one who killed Tamir Rice. These are both officers who've had patterns and practices of violence and predation. And particularly, I just want to focus on the one who killed Tamir Rice. He'd been fired from a police department a year before. The police chief said in his file, this man should never be a police officer. And because there's no national registry of killer cops, he just went down the street, got hired by the police department in the next town over. And then within 15 seconds of him rolling up to a public park, a 12-year-old's dead. And we need a national registry of killer police. There's no local jurisdiction or state jurisdiction that can do that. Congress has to step in. And I particularly would just note here the importance of the End Racial Profiling Act, which has never been enacted by Congress, despite having been proposed for over 2 decades. And there's other planks of the platform. Again, I'd invite people to check it out. This policy, the need to effectuate the movement's goals in policy, is why I'm running for Congress. And I think particularly at the moment, I started out with this and maybe it was too soon to introduce it to the discussion, but when we talk about policing, yes, it's about racial justice. Yes, it's also about police accountability. It is ultimately about if we live in a democracy or whether or not we are going to descend into fully fanged fascism. And this week has brought that choice into very sharp relief when we have a criminal president inviting armed agents of the state who we pay to keep us safe to suppress dissent, deploying chemical weapons to suppress dissent. Just realize what we're talking about, right? Eisenhower warned us in 1961 that the military-industrial complex would shift the spiritual character of our country. He called it. We are witnessing the predictable results of 65 years of ignoring his warning. And our chickens are coming home to roost in very gnarly, disturbing ways. And this is a vital time. I'm glad this discussion is happening. It's a vital time for all of us to be showing up in our communities. And I hope that everybody tuning in now finds a way in your life to take action on what you're learning here tonight.
Wow. So such an important discussion with multiple calls to action, remarkable dissection of what has brought us to this particular moment and the things that have gone wrong to get us here and what we need to be doing in order to move us forward. And it's a conversation that I think this country and we as individuals are going to be having for the next days, weeks, months, years. And it's something that we must heal from and we must continue to move forward from and eventually get to that place that we've all described of just collective understanding of each other's values, especially Black lives. And so I hate to do it, but I'm going to kick it over to Lynn to close us off. This has been such a transformative discussion, one in which you all brought so much value and so much perspective to, and I'm just really grateful to have you all on tonight on this important panel. And yes, just thank you. Thank you so much for all that you do on the ground with your folks, with your communities, and with us tonight. Go ahead, Lynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Lakshmi, and to our amazing guest speakers and community leaders for this insightful and powerful panel discussion tonight. There's no other time to keep pushing for Black Lives Matter and really make it a reality other than now. The people are listening, the world is listening. Cases of police murders that have been considered moot are now reopened, and people are contacting the representatives and organizing in the masses, and it's truly amazing. Now more than ever, we need solidarity in our communities and our workplaces and our streets. So join the movement for Black Lives and sign up at onceagainpac.com. We're raising money for all of these down ballot candidates that were featured here on this live stream. Together, we are going to create that multiracial and progressive block of power needed at every level of government to join forces with us. We will be partnering with Movements for Black Lives to organize for Juneteenth Day of Action on June 19th, next Friday. So again, sign up at onceagainpac.com so that you could join us in this continuous fight and really get engaged next Friday. We hope this has been a thoroughly informative and inspiring discussion for everyone tuning in tonight. Be sure to follow us and our amazing speakers on their journeys. And thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Have a great night.